Time of what was called the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine, 2006, at that point, the U.S. bragged that they had helped to establish 40,000, it's quite an incredible number, 40,000 NGOs and civil society organizations in the Ukraine, funded by USAID and Rockefeller and Soros and Ford and many, many different foundations. But their purpose was to bring Ukraine into alignment with NATO. It was a very, very important part of U.S. plans. Now, if you look at what's happened, there's been a surprise development. So you had a fascist grouping who literally seized hold of the government throughout the elected government. No election. A deal had been made that elections would be held. They seized hold and set up as head of the national police, as head of the military, these fascist organizations, Right Sector, Swoboda. They ousted the elected government, and this created an uprising in eastern and southern Ukraine and in Crimea. In Crimea, the population there knew immediately what joining NATO would mean. But they made no bones about it. The first thing they did on seizing the government was saying, we're outlawing use of Russian as a language. We're ending the autonomy of Crimea. And everyone in Ukraine already knows, and they know this very well, that part of the agreement, the association agreement to join the EU, is joining NATO. That means that the Russian Navy base in the Crimea, it's been there 239 years, reverts immediately to NATO. And people there didn't wait. The very next day they said, we're having a referendum on our future. If you're going to end our autonomy, bar use of Russian, and we know the next step. Now, how did they know the next step? See, this is a game book, a script well written in the past. There was an extreme fascist grouping that seized hold of the government in Croatia, 1990, 91. Was also immediately recognized by Germany and then the US. And what was the first step they did? They outlawed Serbian as a language, and they began a process that led to the expulsion of more than 200,000 Serbs from Croatia. The Serbs had lived in Croatia hundreds of years, hundreds. And yet suddenly pensions were canceled, evictions from public housing, from apartment blocks, firing from all state jobs, and expulsion from the land. Now, this is something well understood in Eastern Europe and in the Ukraine. It's not understood here. It's not known here. Who of us here knows what the Ustasis did in Croatia to the Serbian population? Or in Kosovo? It's important, though, to recognize in another part of the world, this is very well known. And so the immediate connection in Crimea for the Russian population of a law outlawing their autonomy, outlawing the language. They said, we're taking matters into our own hand. So there was a referendum in Crimea, and they withdrew from Ukraine, joined Russia. Now, of course, anywhere that this has happened the other way around, a grouping aligning itself with the West and with NATO, there's been immediate recognition. Immediate. This was certainly true in Yugoslavia, in the whole entire breakup. Every one of the separate republics recognized immediately. But for Crimea to do this, why suddenly the White House went absolutely stark raving mad. I mean, there's no other way to explain the how dare you, and all the messages that this just doesn't happen in the 21st century. And of course also immediately painting it all as the crime is being committed by Russia. They're taking over. Now, the response in East and Southern Ukraine is very interesting because it's really decisive. People's power is always underestimated in the arrogance of power. This is the center of an empire, a huge empire, 1,000 bases around the world. We can't get away from this. We can have one feeling for our family and relatives here, but the government, we have to know this government represents Wall Street, and it is the center of a huge empire. And they're rolling forward, whether it's with NATO, whether it's the encirclement of China, whether what they call the Asia pivot, or the encirclement of Russia, or their right to arm an opposition in Venezuela, or Honduras, or any other country which they feel they want to take over course and direction again. Now, in the Ukraine, I keep getting to this point and backing up, but it's very important to recognize what happened when people went into the streets, took over the city halls in one town and city after the other, set up a blockade. They said there's an illegal government that has seized power in Kiev, simply taking over the government buildings, appointing themselves the head of the police, passing out the arms. We're taking the same measures here. These were working people. This is the most industrialized part and in the mining center of the Ukraine. It is an example that people's power can be stronger than military power when it's organized. Now, here was an article from the New York Times, April 17th, and I really loved it. It was titled, "Ukraine's Push Against Rebels Grinds to a Halt." Ukraine meaning the fascists in Kiev. It said a military operation that the Ukrainian government said would confront pro-Russian militants in the east of the country unraveled in disarray on Wednesday with an entire contingent of 21 armored vehicles that had separated into two columns, surrendering and pulling back before nightfall. This is a glaring humiliation for the new government in Kiev. Sure is. I mean, it's actually a very good description, even for the New York Times, a very objective situation of what happened. That tanks and armored units and military units were sent in to the east to try to seize back control. And the soldiers, very much as Veterans of Peace were describing, they're not like battle hardened yet. And they said, why should we fire on our brothers and sisters? They took the magazines out of their guns and they held up the flag of what is now called the People's Republic of Donetsk. Now, it's very interesting also what the People's Republic of Donetsk put forth in seizing government buildings and the military, because it shows that this can unravel in all kinds of directions that are a surprise to the US, maybe a surprise to Russia too. They're calling for renationalizing the industries, getting rid of the oligarchs. They're saying we have a right to set up our own government, and we have a right to take the industries back from everyone who's been doing the privatizing for the last 20 years. So that pushed anxiety buttons everywhere, but especially in terms of both Washington and the European Union, who have put enormous energy, strategy, and plans. What's the real purpose of NATO? It's to be a military force in place if the people decide they don't like capitalism, that they want their own industries back. They don't trust the local military in any of these countries. So the purpose of destroyers and aircraft missiles, anti-aircraft, and all kinds of training in the West. And also all of these thousands and thousands of NGOs where young people go for training in Berlin and Frankfurt and New York and Chicago is to try to tie hand and foot these formerly socialist countries to look to the West for everything and to be trained in the West. So the development with this People's Republic of Donetsk, this is a very interesting sort of history is being made as we're sitting here. And we don't know, we do know the response that's coming from Washington, from the Obama administration, from the aircraft carriers moving, from the tanks, from the drones, from the overflights that are happening. Now, the Ukrainian fascist forces, they next said they wanted to send in what are their elite Alpha Special Forces. The Alpha Special Forces said, well, we're actually an elite force. We're to be used as a surgical tool in hostage and other situations, and you just don't use a scalpel to cut down a tree. That was a good way of saying no. Then there were mercenaries provided by the U.S., some of whom were just actually seized today and yesterday. They first said they were part of the OSCE. The OSCE said, we have nothing to do with them, we don't know who they are. Blackwater, or now called Greystone, are there in the thousands. And we know that that can make a truly bloody mess. In Syria, where tens of thousands of mercenaries and jihadists have been sent in, paid for by Washington and Saudi Arabia, a third of the population today of Syria are displaced or homeless. Wars uproot millions of people. And they're the ones who really pay. They're the ones who truly pay. I want to say, I was in Yugoslavia during the US NATO bombing. At the end of the war, they counted up. They had bombed 428 schools and 14 tanks. There was really no military threat in Yugoslavia, but it was an effort to break the will of the people to bomb hospitals and schools and communication centers and the electric grid. It was the same thing in Iraq. And to see in Iraq where the number of children who die when the sanitation and sewage is destroyed in a calculated way, and there's no antibiotics. This is really what is targeted. In Syria, just in September, seeing so many displaced people who are living now in community centers like this, all over the country, because their homes have been absolutely just destroyed. It's the only secure way to survive and provide a cafeteria with food and some form of continued education for the children. U.S. wars create a horror on the ground, and they are calculated to lay havoc to the civilian population. There's a military capacity to destroy the world several times over with nuclear weapons, but that just leaves incineration. Even for the capitalists, that's not really an option. But we do need to know that there's a real danger that they are capable, when all of these huge guns and destroyers and missiles and are moving into place, that something horrendous could happen. And what's happening now on the ground, when you look at any of the images, I want to go back to the People's Republics that are being set up. It's a mix of Russian flags and red flags. There are all kinds of political debates and how to proceed. it's a danger for Wall Street, because this example could spread all over East Europe. There are a lot of, it could spread in Western Europe. Look at the people in Greece who've seen their pensions just totally ripped to pieces. And the pay cut by more than 40%. That's austerity. We gotta pay the banks. And to pay the banks, it's no different in Spain or in Ireland. It's true half the countries of the European Union. And what does Ukraine expect in joining the European Union? Well, they had found out the first week. Pensions would be cut, pay would be cut, money for infrastructure would be cut. The U.S. immediately pledged $10 billion, but it's $10 billion that will never even pass through Ukraine. It's just $10 billion to pay the very banks. We pay $10 billion, and that goes straight to the banks. At the very time that $8 billion was just cut, very same time, $8 billion was cut from food stamps, the SNAP program, right here in the U.S., because there wasn't enough money. But there's an immediate decision that $10 billion can go to the Ukraine, on top of the $5 billion that already went for the Great Democracy Movement. So I don't want to take any more time, because we really wanted time for discussion. I'm going to just close on one thing. There were negotiations in Geneva, right? They said the negotiations between Russia, European Union, the US, and the fascists who have the government in Kiev. 2 days after the Kiev government the fascists seized power, right away, Yatsenyuk is invited to the White House. You know, there are countries that wait decades for such an invitation. But 2 days later, there was an invitation to the White House, the UN Security Council, everything to give diplomatic recognition. There was a meeting in Geneva. What was agreed to in Geneva was people who have seized government buildings should give up the buildings. Those who seized arms should give up the arms. US thought that was directed at East Ukraine and South Ukraine. East and South Ukraine said, oh, we agree, but you got to start with Kiev. They seize the buildings, they seize the arms. They're first, and when they do it, then we'll do it. And the response from Washington was, well, Russia has to go in and enforce this, but don't you dare move any troops. So it's really setting up an impossible demand, and one that the people on the ground, their ability to make decisions themselves, that's where we should place our greatest confidence, and refuse to go along with demonization. Know that there are big forces in motion, both from White House, from Wall Street with NATO, but also coming from the ground up. And that is what can make history and change history. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Sarah. Very terrific presentation, and I will come over to you. We'll try to work it pretty quick.
I was very impressed by what everyone said, and I have to say that the last point that was made, that the last 3 points that were made actually, about the imminence of a possible war by design or accident, makes me think that we really have to proceed on a 3-point program real quickly. The first one is pull our forces back from the brink and just have a people's uprising that dwarfs what happened with Syria, the Syrian situation, be in the streets everywhere, including Long Island, to prevent that from happening. I remember that being done in 1979 with Iran. I remember it being done later this year with Syria. So with Ukraine and Russia. Second point, real quickly, I was always raised to think that revolution in one country was doomed to failure. Okay, these people in Donetsk and Kharkiv and elsewhere can't be hung out to dry. And the next almost simultaneous step has to be, I think, just across the board support for them. And the third, of course, turning to our own country and making sure that the forces in this country that favor the reversal, the reversal of this horrendous larceny by the less than 1%, which is making this happen, that be reversed. And I don't think there can be a long period of time between these steps. Somehow they have to be simultaneous.
Thank you, Barry. This man here had something to say?
Hello. I'd like to hear something about the road to peace. What would be some proposals to make peace in these conditions right now?
Okay. We'll get the panel.
Let's hear
Okay,
from the
that's,
audience.
good. Yes, I know, Brian, you wanted to say something? If they like, yes. If you want to introduce yourself, that'll be fine.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Brian Matarese, and like Mac, I'm a longtime member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. It was kind of interesting to hear Sarah talk about troops refusing to fight. You know, we're not going in, they took their magazines out and just didn't fight. This year is the 100th anniversary of the Christmas truce in World War I. Now, what the Christmas truce was, soldiers on the Western Front, French, German, English, on Christmas declared a truce. The soldiers, not the officers, not the officer corps. They laid down their weapons for a day. They went out, they had meals together, they played soccer. Now, unfortunately, the war started up again because the officers threatened everybody with court martials and whatever else. But it was a historic moment during the war. And what we're doing this year, and we're having a meeting May 17th in New York, we're calling together all veterans groups, and later on, as soon as we establish what we're going to do, we're going to reach out to every other group possible to celebrate this historic occasion and mark it for what it was, a time where the soldiers said, well, we're not going to fight, and they didn't. And if anyone wants more information, they can go to the Vets for Peace website or the New York City Veterans Peace Council, and you'll get more information on it. The meeting is May 17th, and the address, which I don't have offhand, will be on those websites, okay? Or you can go to the VVAW one also, and you'll find more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else that had something to say? Or we could have, okay, sorry, here we go. I feel like Phil Donahue.
Yes, I just wanted to back up a minute. We talked about the big picture. There's a number of things going on that I think a lot of people are not aware of and that the media has not disclosed, although some of them you may know. Russia is in the process of negotiating a huge deal for energy with the Chinese, oil and gas. And they're also in the process of negotiating a huge deal for the same with Japan. A 20-year deal in which they're going to run tremendous gas pipelines to Japan. It's very significant, I think, that the Europeans have virtually told Obama they're not going to slap on sanctions. And the only sanctions that have been slapped on today, either way, are some that are almost meaningless for these countries. The Soviet Union is negotiating to send their energy elsewhere, and Europe in the future is going to desperately need that energy. As for the Ukraine, the question is still is in my mind, why the Ukraine, why now? The Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991. The entire Soviet Union was a basket case, along with Ukraine, economically. And they have been virtually ever since. And I wouldn't call it Russian largesse that's kept them afloat. Russia had its reasons for giving them money and for giving them discounted energy prices. But they did that. When the Soviet Union broke up, Russia was left with the vast majority of resources, particularly oil and gas. The countries that broke off had next to nothing. So the question, when this first came up, I said, why is the West and Russia fighting over a basket case? Another Greece, another Spain, another Italy. And I still am not sure that the answer to that question. All that's going to be required now is an endless stream of money poured into the Ukraine. The Ukraine it was corrupt before it broke off. It was corrupt when it broke off. It's still corrupt today, both East and West Ukraine. And both are going to require tremendous amounts of money. Ironically, the Soviet Union, Russia has already sunk more money in the Ukraine that it can ever logically expect to be paid back. Until today. Today, Russia can say, well, the West is going to have to pick up the bill for all of what Ukraine owes us, which is a huge amount of money. Otherwise, Ukraine's in default. So the question in my mind is why? Why are these two powers? Is Putin actually pulling a fast one here and figures he's going to end up with his naval base on the Black Sea, and the West is going to get to bail out the Ukraine from now forward for as long as it takes with money they don't have?
Anybody else have anything to add, or if anybody on the panel wants to say? Don? You can address it.
Just to answer that first while it's fresh. Speculating, of course. But you brought up a couple of interesting points that kind of lead to one answer. In the previous period, when you had competition between the Western Bloc and the USSR, you also had this strong ideological diversion, cleavage between the two. And so there was no way for the Soviet Union to make an appeal to the elites in France, for example, that, why don't you play on our team instead of theirs? Because their team meant essentially you reorganize your economy, your elite gets dispossessed of its power and influence, and you wouldn't have a mirror image of our society. Ultimately, in any event, that's the fullest expression of that kind of relationship. That doesn't exist now. Now you're looking at, one model of global capitalism that's, full of contradictions and exhausted in some ways, and another that's rising, that's sitting on top of all of these resources, that geographically, for example, is much more efficient to ship gas and oil to Japan from Russia, from Siberia, than it is from, shale in Pennsylvania or whatever. So there are all kinds of things that militate towards a restructuring of the alliances, if it's allowed to, come to fruition, if it's allowed to, fulfill itself. That is an objective reality that I think all of the players are aware of, and that is looming pretty heavily, and we've seen some major developments along that line over the last year or two. When they had the little crisis with the debt ceiling and stuff here, you heard noises about creating currency. There's been development banks and other projects that would look at deeper integration of another global model across the board that can compete. So I think some folks here are looking at this time as being, close to the precipice of a real competition crisis, and so it may well be that that's what's driving